Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this event. Thanks so much for coming out on this very wintry day. We appreciate you being with us this morning, and to all those online following the event, good morning to you as well. My name is Ryan Berg. I'm the director of the Americas program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This morning's event will cover major elements driving investment uncertainty in the 2026 USMCA review, an event that's part of our USMCA strategic initiative here at the Center. The initiative tries to make actionable policy recommendations to ensure that the agreement continues to deliver for workers, strengthen supply chain security, and maintain North America's position as one of the most competitive regional economies in the global economy. Before we begin this morning, just a few notes on the logistics. We'll go for about 60 minutes. Following the panelist discussion, there may be an opportunity for questions from the audience. Due to the size and also the expertise that we have on the panel, we're going to prioritize the discussion. So if it's flowing and there's no time for questions, I apologize in advance. Nevertheless, if you want to submit a question, please go to the event webpage and click on the button that says Ask Live Question. Alternatively, you can scan the QR code that you see here above our heads, and it will take you to that page directly. You can input a question there. Again, good morning, and thank you very much for being here. The USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is the lifeblood of the North American economy. Late last year, Mexico became both the top exporter to the United States and the top importer of U.S. goods. About $3 million a minute in products move across the U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada borders, with inter-regional trade growing by 37% and job growth by 18% since the agreement took effect in 2020. The 2026 review of the USMCA will therefore be a defining moment for the future of these economic realities. In front and center of these negotiations are rising regional investment uncertainties between the United States and Mexico, due to two major elements that we're going to focus on this morning in the event. First is taxation issues, and second is the judicial reform in Mexico. A lack of double taxation treaty and harmonizing tax rules has resulted in double taxation on some companies operating in North America and alleged compliance issues for other companies. No fewer than 24 companies find themselves in tax disputes with the Mexican government. Compounding the challenge, Mexico's judicial overhaul has emptied out longstanding expertise on the bench in business and financial matters. The judicial reform, purportedly done in the name of increasing transparency and broadening access to judicial positions, has been met with widespread criticism over concerns about politicization, instability for investment, and the potential erosion of judicial independence. So these are some of the issues we want to unpack this morning on this panel. We're delighted to have four experts with us to help get into the complex landscape. Let me introduce our panel, and then we'll begin the discussion. Directly to my left is Ambassador Arturo Sarucán. He's a former Mexican ambassador to the United States and a non-resident senior advisor here at the Americas program. He is president of Sarucán & Associates, LLC, a distinguished visiting scholar at the USC Annenberg Public Diplomacy School, and a postgraduate professor at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Next to the ambassador is Brad Wood. He's the Senior Director of Trade and Innovation Policy at the National Foreign Trade Council, one of the leading business associations dedicated to advancing the interests of U.S. companies in international commerce. He previously served in consecutive roles at the Embassy of Canada, including the Trade Program Manager for Innovation and Industrial Policy. Brad also represented Canada internationally, including at the World Trade Organization. Next to Brad is Karen Amtebi. She's Director and International Practice Chair at Prime Policy Group and a former Mexican trade negotiator. She has over 20 years of experience at the intersection of global trade, policy, and diplomacy. Previously, as economic counselor at the Embassy of Mexico in Washington, she led the government's U.S. outreach during the renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA. And finally, on the very end, we have Diego Marroquin Bitar, who's a fellow here at the CSIS Americas program. Diego was previously the inaugural Burson Foster North America Scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and has co-founded the North America Project at the U.S.-Mexico Foundation and the nonprofit North America 3.0. Prior to that, he worked at the Brookings Institution. So we have an excellent panel for you this morning. I've asked each speaker to kick off with no more than about 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes of remarks, giving kind of a high-level lay of the land, and then we'll get into the discussion. We'll start with you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ryan. Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for coming out. It's getting pretty chilly, or at least it was very chilly when I left to come here this morning. Look, there's no doubt that 2026 is going to be a crucial year for U.S.-Mexico relations and for Mexico itself. I would even dare say North America, simply because of the dynamics that we're seeing play out and the fact that we have the review process of the USMCA this year. Why is it going to be critical? Because three things are going to collide. You've got the 2026 statutory review of USMCA, which will likely start before July 1st, at some point, maybe end of first trimester of this year. You still have the ongoing negotiations between Canada, Mexico, and the United States on the punitive retaliatory tariffs, whether under IEEPA or under Section 232. We're still all waiting with bated breath to see what the Supreme Court rules on the IEEPA tariffs. But the fact is that, remember, there was a November 1st deadline, which was kicked down the road by the Trump administration. Conversations are still ongoing with Canada and Mexico. Remember, both have been slapped since April of last year with tariffs of 25%, with a carve-out for anything that complies with USMCA rules of origin. And at the same time that those negotiations and conversations are going, you will have very likely an overlap with the start of the review process of USMCA. And then in the case of Mexico, you have all of this made even more complex by what I think will be the third prong of a very challenging year, which is the ongoing conversations on law enforcement and counter-narcotics collaboration. We're not going to talk about that, but I've said publicly that my view is that these issues will be used by the administration to pressure, to leverage the negotiations both on the USMCA review and on the punitive 25% tariffs. And to a certain extent, Secretary of Economy Marcelo Ebrard, Mexico's Secretary of Economy, it's going to be his task to do both tracks 1 and 2, that is, continue to negotiate, hopefully, either the elimination of those tariffs or a reduction of those Section 232 tariffs to a lower level from where they are today, and the review process of the USMCA. But his key partner in that negotiation, in those negotiations, is going to be Public Security Secretary Omar Garcia-Harfuch, because of how the administration is clearly linking, in the case of Mexico, these two issues together. To the specific issues that Ryan would like us to address today, you will recall that despite what I've just said, starting in August when Trump postponed the tariffs for a second time till November the 1st, USTR and the White House mentioned non-tariff trade barriers as a key obstacle in finding a solution to those tariffs and to the potential review of USMCA. And it is precisely issues like the weaponization of Mexico's IRS, the SAT, which many companies have been facing. Yes, it is true that historically there has been very significant tax evasion in the Mexican economy, but what has been happening for the past 7 years is clearly the use of Mexico's IRS, sometimes to politically put pressure on companies that have been critical of government policies, sometimes because there are outstanding debts and they're seeking, and so the IRS puts out a sort of a high target to negotiate with companies that are in debt. But there's no doubt that the weaponization of government institutions, you see that with many of the concerns regarding the judicial reform. One of the key challenges of the judicial reform that was approved in Mexico is that it eliminates a level playing field, it eliminates legal certainty. This is going to be one of the big issues regarding the review as we head into 2026. And along with other issues, telco phytosanitary permits, etc., that are piling up and that haven't been resolved. Some are being addressed by the Mexican government, but there are still others that are outstanding. So you put all of this together, and these issues become very salient in what we will be seeing, I think, in the coming weeks. And it will, in many ways, how they address these non-tariff trade barriers, weaponization of Mexico's tax system, weaponization of the judiciary, the effects of the judicial reform are going to play a very significant role. And I'll leave it there, and then we can start digging into some of the issues.
Thank you, Ambassador. Brad?
That's a fantastic lay of the land, and just brings us up to speed on 2026. Brad Wood with the National Foreign Trade Council. For those that are not familiar with NFTC, we represent companies domiciled here in the United States, representing over $6 trillion in revenue, employing more than 6 million Americans, and they have operations around the world. They have supply chains around the world. And their operations, their footprints, their customer base, one of the largest partners that they rely on is Mexico and Canada. And so getting the USMCA renewed is a top priority for NFTC and for our members. But at the same time, we need to work through some of the taxation issues. We need to work through some of the technical barriers that have come up in the relationship. While we agree and support the agreement as it is written, there is room for upgrades. But this effort that USTR and the interagency has underway to address some of these trade irritants is paramount. And some of the audit challenges, Brian mentioned that there's more than 24 companies that are facing challenges. A number of those companies are NFTC members, and the recent changes that have not only the audits, but the pay-to-play, the requirement for companies to pay those tax burdens and have those funds tied up, creates a strong disincentive to continued investment, and I think that's something that will impact a little bit more. What's even more challenging is some of these issues have been going on for years, but as the ambassador said, if you look at the 2026 fiscal package of Mexico, there are a number of new provisions that have been introduced that are even more challenging, and so unfortunately they're doubling down on these issues. Just reinforcing what the ambassador said, we hope 2026 can be the year that we see USMCA renewed and extended, but there's a lot of work to be done. So I'll pause there and we can unpack it further.
Thank you so much, Brad. Karen?
Hi, so I echo my co-panelists' statements. So I was thinking, why did we negotiate NAFTA? Why was Mexico interested in negotiating NAFTA? Why would the US and Canada agree to such an agreement? And then, why we sought to keep it in the last Trump administration. And yes, Mexico was at the time attracting investment and wanting to build an export base, and those have not changed. But what was central to the agreement at that time was to introduce the rules that would give economic actors the certainty to make long-term investments. And those were based on transparency, on predictability, and given what has happened within the last few years in Mexico, or in the last 24 months, with the judicial reform, with the tax reform, I think the price for companies to invest has gone up. There's added risk. And I believe that, while we might want to kind of be nostalgic and want to keep the old system, I think that the reality is that the government of Mexico has to take a hard look and see if those are still the goals that it wants to achieve, then it has to rely on more than just the USMCA review to make that happen. And I'll leave it there.
Terrific. Diego?
Yes, thank you. I'm really glad to be at yet another North America panel. I just realized we have members from Canada, from Mexico, and from the US. I see today a Mexico that embodies a paradox. I see two Mexicos in direct conflict. On one hand, we have a Mexico that is at the forefront of the nearshoring wave, a country with a unique geographical advantage, with the most dynamic border region in the world, a country where at least 34 states have Mexico as their either first, second, or third main export destination. A country alongside Canada that shares, I would argue, the sole surviving trade agreement, a comprehensive trade framework is still standing after Liberation Day. Mexico has a tariff exposure on average of 5% compared to Canada's 10% or China's 36%. And if we were to aggregate the rest of the world, it would be close to 19%. So there's a clear advantage there. Despite that, results are below expectations. And let me use a football analogy here I've used before. On paper, Mexico should be the Real Madrid of nearshoring. In practice, we're playing like a mid-table team. And this is where the other Mexico comes from. A Mexico of structural challenges, a country that persistently underperforms, of a country of self-inflicted pain. If we just looked at the economic projections, they're very low. They're between 0.3% and 1.2% for this year. Mexico has the lowest accumulated GDP and GDP per capita in Latin America in the last 35 years, obviously excluding Venezuela, but only Brazil, Argentina, and Ecuador have grown less than Mexico in the last 3 decades. And countries like Brazil, they don't have an FTA with the US. So what's the core problem and the main reason that we're here together? It's investment. Yes, Mexico makes headlines by reaching record levels of foreign direct investment, but FDI is only 10% of the total investment the country receives each year. If we look at the total investment figures from June 2024, that is when President Sheinbaum got elected, until September 2025, total investment is down 10%. Private investment is down 2%. And shockingly, public investment is down 26%, with metrics like public investment in infrastructure down 64% and public investment in education down 51%. So this explains the paradox of the two Mexicos. Nearshoring is real, yet it doesn't translate into broad-based, sustained economic growth. And in fact, it is being offset by collapsing public and private investment. So what's the takeaway here? Again, Mexico is a country of huge opportunities, but it is a country as well that continues to introduce risk that undermines its investment proposition, where foreign and national investors increasingly think that any dispute against the Mexican state is lost before it starts, where final decisions by courts are subject to review and changed, and they can be changed retroactively. So how can we bridge this divide? Again, it's investment. Without a reversal in investment trends, Mexico's economy will continue to stagnate. The less investment we have today is the less growth that we have tomorrow. So I'm glad that the main focus of our conversation today is to look at the main sources of investment uncertainty, which in this case we'll discuss fiscal governance in Mexico alongside as the judicial reform and others.
Great, thank you, Diego. Thanks everyone for those excellent sets of opening remarks to kind of set the stage. And I'll just start off right where Diego left off, which is the uncertainty question due to some of the things we've seen in Mexico's domestic politics. Maybe I'll start with you, Brad. Uncertainty is often described as the greatest killer of investment. Diego went through the numbers. In Mexico's case, how are some of these domestic developments contributing to the perception of heightened risk among some of your members in terms of what they think about when thinking about investing in Mexico?
Well, I think Diego did a fantastic job of just framing the investment risks and what's going on in Mexico. I think there's 2 elements right now to the investment risk.
Except his poor choice of football team. It should have been Barcelona, but
who has more
you
Champions
say
Leagues?
Poor choice of football, and as American Canadian, I was saying, which football are we talking about?
The real one.
That's fair. In terms of
We'll resolve that in another panel.
In terms of the Mexican side, and what we're here to talk about today is the investment piece within Mexico and what they need to do in terms of increasing the incentive and the confidence for companies to make those investments. At the same time, what we need is also to restore investment or to restore predictability through seeing USMCA extended. And so we're in a world where 2025 saw IEEPA tariffs put on countries globally. We saw that USMCA non-conforming goods are facing tariffs. There's 232 tariffs in place, and we hope that we can resolve and have trade agreements both bilaterally as well as USMCA to lower those. However, there is a broader question of, if trading is not safe with anyone in the world, where does the U.S. want to source its inputs from? If there are tariffs on Vietnam, if there's tariffs on Cambodia, if there's tariffs on China, you need a trusted and stable supply base, and all of that manufacturing cannot be re-domiciled to the U.S. Yeah. And so I think there's a strong case and a strong interest for Mexico here to create an investment environment that will attract the investment and be that, neighbor of choice to the United States with the shared footprint to help bring about an alternative to less trusted states that are of concern to this government in the United States, and the opportunity to actually turn what some of these challenges are in the judicial reform. Some of the SAT audits reflect on that and find an opportunity to incentivize, continued investment. But ultimately, it was going to require changing some of the practices they've done in the SAT recently and some of the new proposals that they put forward.
Okay. And I do want to get into what's been done and also what is being proposed in the 2026 legislation.
Can I jump?
Please,
jump
go
in
ahead.
on,
Yeah, that was going to come to you anyway.
This is an important issue because I think there's a systemic structural contradiction. You're absolutely right. If you look at how the U.S. Will probably be positioned once we have a bit of clarity as to what happens with AIPA and how the administration pivots on that. I've always said, look, Washington is immersed today in the most important recalibration of its foreign policy and its national security interests since the end of the Cold War, and that's its relationship with China. But for that recalibration to succeed, you need Canada and Mexico because of supply chains, because of contiguous land borders, because of energy security, because of cybersecurity issues, data protection, the digital economy. All the hard data should point to the US and Mexico understanding the opportunity, despite the trade war that has been unleashed by the Trump administration, of what you've described just lining up and happening. And I quite frankly think that there are some in the Mexican government that fully understand this and that really want to capitalize it. I think the economy ministry in Mexico generally gets this and is pursuing this, and that's why I think they've spent most of their bandwidth trying to get the tariff issue as much as they can solved or at least aligned to what will be coming down the pike with the USMCA. But there are other actors and entities in Mexico's political ecosystem that have a completely different view. Now, there's one good piece of news, which is something that most observers in Mexico would have likely not thrown out there when López Obrador got elected, which was that there was a Damascene moment in Morena and López Obrador's recent history. Remember López Obrador, when he ran in 2006 and then again in 2012, ran against NAFTA. NAFTA is bad for the Mexican economy. We don't like the rules of the game. We don't think that NAFTA has delivered the goods that it was supposed to deliver. In 2018, when he got finally elected, that changed completely. And even with some of the more Taliban wings of Morena, there is a certain understanding that Mexico's mooring into the North American economy is essential for many of the things that they really do care about. A lot of the unconditional cash transfers that are propping up Morena and its political hold on Mexico. If they're going to continue to hand out money as if they were M&Ms, they need Mexico's mooring into the North American economy. But it's this tension that you're seeing today between those who understand that we need to move the needle if we're going to be able to ensure the survival of USMCA via the review process. Because, even though some may say, well, if we do end up in an annual review, it's not that bad, we've got this until 2036. In terms of predictability and certainty, which is an issue that I know your companies are dead set on, it's a disastrous result.
It's a disaster, and there's still 6 months.
But it's probably the most likely result.
It could be the likely result. So how those voices and actors in the Mexican government are able to corral those who still haven't understood what's at stake, those that believe, and I'll say it, in the Mexican private sector, oh, we're too big to fail, he's not going to, Trump is not going to pull the trigger at the end of the day. They're not reading what's really going on in Washington. And so I think there is a need for the Mexican private sector, for the US private sector, to send an unequivocal message that we need to solve some of these issues. We've got to take some of these issues off the board, because if we don't provide that basic level of certainty, not only will we not be able to capitalize, I think, the geostrategic opportunities that North America has ahead of itself in the coming years, but the whole review process itself will be facing a very bumpy ride.
And I would encourage everybody to the ambassador's point, to look at the remarks that USTR Ambassador Greer gave to a House committee, I believe on December 18th of last year. There's a 15-page report. That essentially
Is the report.
It is the report, the one that was supposed to come out on January 3rd. That is serving as the report. The bluff there, the bottom line up front, is that the USTR cannot recommend in good faith automatic renewal of the USMCA without significant changes, the likes of which we're talking about today on this panel. Karen, I want to ask you a question, and then I'll get to you, Diego, about the audits. We've heard from a number of folks here about audits and the type of environment that it creates, which is to say an environment of significant uncertainty. And there's also the perception, I think, that there's a kind of lack of transparency here as well. So as a former negotiator, talk about in the kinds of ways in which this erodes trust in Mexico's fiscal governance from the investment standpoint. I mean, you work with companies as well.
Right. So the USMCA does not include a tax treaty, nor does it have elements to address this. But when a company doesn't know when things are final, or what it may look like, or how it should act, then the risk premium goes up, and they delay investment decisions. And I think that what we're seeing is companies hesitating to make long-term investments, the kind of investments that are needed for growth, for real development, if you want. Companies are reinvesting their profits. They might make adjustments, but you're not seeing the kind of investments that my co-panelists have mentioned are so essential for the country's and the region's competitiveness. So to that extent, clear, transparent, predictable rules are needed. So if there is a decision, that decision should be final. It should not be retroactive. If there is a tax or a new tax to be introduced, that should have some sort of a runway so that companies can adapt. If there is a change in the way that the IMEX program is going to work, that should be done along with real and meaningful consultations with the private sector and the economic actors to see what kind of impacts these are going to have within the broader objective, which is really how do we attract investment, how do we create more jobs, how do we make this meaningful, and at the same time address the very real need that the Mexican government faces, which is how do we get more money?
Exactly.
With a huge fiscal deficit.
Now, I would say, to Arturo's point, I feel that the U.S.-China relationship is probably the most stable right now, if compared to the rest in the world. But that's for another panel.
You mentioned IMEX, so I want to get into that in a second. First, I want to go to Diego and just note that we we responded to the USTR's inquiry for comments during the review process. We were part of the USMCA review, in that you also testified before the Commission. I think in your report back on how the environment was there, tax issues came up time and time again in what you heard during your time there. How do you think U.S. negotiators are likely to think about this in the review process? Do you have any inkling of how the strategy might be shaping up in terms of kind of what you heard at the hearing and what you've seen since?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so looking at the other side of the table, not from the USTR's perspective, but from all the 150 companies, NGOs, and nonprofits that participated in this process, the message was clear. USMCA works, but there are significant issues that need to be addressed, and fiscal governance, judicial reform are one of those. If you look up all the testimonies, fiscal governance is there in almost every company that has a presence in Mexico, particularly in the manufacturing sector. Now, from Mexico's negotiating perspective, the more trade irritants or non-trade irritants, as Ambassador Sarkhan was saying, we're not only discussing trade these days. Trade is part of conversations regarding bilateral water management, regarding security, fiscal issues, and the more issues Mexico has, or the more reasons the U.S. government has to tell Mexico to pull its weight, the harder will be for Mexico to negotiate. The easier will be for Mexico to concede, and it will be harder again to convince stakeholders in the U.S. that USMCA is still their best bet. So if we don't address those issues now, the closer we get to July 1st, the most likely is going to be that we end up in this 10-year review process, and then we'll face its consequences, as we've discussed so far. If you don't know what are the rules of the game going to be in the next 10 years, what incentives do you have to invest if it takes years for a company to see a return on their investment?
Can I build off
Brad?
that?
Sure.
In terms of what we might see moving forward, the ambassador talked about the state of play and where the bilateral discussions are. Ambassador Greer's report, which Ryan mentioned, references that they've made significant progress with Mexico in terms of a bilateral deal. There were 50 odd issues given to Mexico in terms of issues that they want to see advanced. And I think Mexico, in good faith, has made tremendous progress, and they are getting closer to potentially announcing something ahead of USMCA. Will that happen? That is ultimately going to be up to the negotiators. All these processes could be conflated. Geopolitical events could overtake the goodwill, and we could be at this for a while. But I think there is that progress there. However, some of these issues that came out in the 2026 economic package are new. And I think they have the risk to derail the potential goodwill there if we can't see them in advance. I have a sense that USTR does not want to give Mexico a moving target. So they do not want to add to these issues because they want to see a sense of alignment. But nonetheless, that's why I also think it's inherently in Mexico's interest to see some of these addressed. Yes. With Canada, we saw how the negotiations were paused over Canada's digital services tax. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the proposals here with Mexico is the clawback of credits from the maquiladora and the double taxation, which means now for American companies to challenge those tax audits in Mexico, you have to put a 100% deposit into escrow, for lack of a better way of describing it, and those funds are on hold until the court case can be resolved, which can take years. It can take a decade. In some cases, because this goes back years, that level of funds that are tied up often exceeds the company's sales within the Mexican market. It is a tremendous amount hindering reinvestment.
And sorry to add on to that, the scenario that you're describing gets even more complicated because of the lack of judicial certainty.
Well,
and the ability of
you're
the
adjudicating
federal
within
government
exactly.
to capture the judiciary. And so you go to a judge who's getting orders from SAT, from SAT, and then you're in a pickle.
Well, and this is exactly it. I mean, this is where, and what Ryan very astutely kind of brought these together because it conflates the two issues. And when you combine these tax challenges with concerns, we do not know how the changes to the judicial system in Mexico will evolve, but there is growing uncertainty, a lack of confidence, and if you do not feel as though these tax challenges will be fairly adjudicated, you're in a difficult position. Yeah, pause there and we can come back to it.
You brought something else up as well. I want to do a quick follow-up with you, Brad, and then I want to go to Karen for a question about EMEX because you brought it up. First, on the things that have been introduced in 2026, Article 30B. This is something that you and I have talked about before. For those who don't know, this is something that gives the tax authority, the SAT, real-time access to transaction data for companies, including withholding VAT and income tax on certain sales. How did these rules create extra burdens and higher costs for companies? And how do they, I think we've talked in a few instances how they might abrogate some of the clauses in USMCA. There's a lot at stake here, especially for companies in the digital services and digital space.
Well, that's exactly it. A lot of the tax challenges that we've been talking about up until this point have been focused on either investment issues, supply chain issues, tax credits, but some of these proposals in the 2026 economic package are more akin to a digital services tax or have that digital lean. Article 30B requires SAT to have direct kind of back-end access into digital platforms. And so you think if you are an online streaming service or an online marketplace, this is an unprecedented level of access that SAT is asking to get into the back-end systems of these companies. And so colloquially, it is being referred to as a kill switch because if the companies do not grant this access, the measure permits Mexico to prohibit their access to the Mexican market. And so you can imagine a large online platform or a large streaming service, a e-commerce, that if you do not comply with requests that exceed any other territory, any other taxation measures that would risk some of your secret sauce, some of the internal kind of data and mechanics that you rely on, then you can be prohibited from the Mexican market. And so this Article 30B is not set to take effect until April, but that is coming very quickly, and so it's of significant concern. And in addition, they also put in place a video game tax of 8%. And that video game tax, if you were just taxing which has been put on hold. I think that one has been paused.
It was paused.
That one, if you're taxing simply, a video game, sure. It's not that much different than a GST. However, if that video game is part of an online platform, the tax measure would tax the entire platform's operations, which can be much broader. And so that's where we're concerned. So it is good that they put that on hold. And I think there's a level of recognition amongst Mexican officials and the taxation authorities that they need to review some of these. But we just hope that we can elevate that because it is becoming more dire.
Karen, if I can, I want to ask you a question about EMEX because you brought it up. For those who don't know, this is Mexico's main incentive program for export-oriented factories, allowing companies that do business in some of these areas to import parts and materials tax-free as long as the finished products are exported. The Mexican government and the tax authorities have increasingly challenged how companies use this program and affected certainty in that sense. They've argued that taxes, and especially the VAT, should still be paid in these cases. So this has triggered disputes, as you mentioned in a previous intervention, and also claims of billions that are owed to the Mexican government in back taxes across a couple different cases. Some of them are now, in fact, in the Supreme Court. Talk about how this is creating uncertainty and also perhaps how this might be resolved.
Again, so the EMEX program is really the 21st century version of what the maquiladora industry is, but it is much more sophisticated than just the mere assembly of inputs.
Yeah.
it creates a lot of jobs. And as Arturo says, at the point when companies do not know under what ground are they operating, they are more hesitant to continue with their investments or to expand their investments. How do you solve this? I think that there's got to be a limit to retroactivity, and that should have been established from the very onset. So as they are moving this forward, I think that retroactivity has got to be stopped, or at least established a very clear time frame from when that applies, and it cannot be, multiple years. I think moving forward, clearly having clear and transparent and published rules with timelines as to what is expected from companies should also be established. In addition, because these tend to be highly technical issues that get addressed, the possibility of establishing dedicated courts that have judges that have been trained in the subject matter and that can be seen as independent, so that in cases where, as the ambassador mentioned, they might get a call from the tax authorities, they can make independent decisions. And I think those are some of the elements on how this can be addressed.
Thank you, Karen. Diego?
If I may say something. So let's think of EMEX as let's think of a Mexican company as a big bakery. And the EMEX programs allows you to import your flour, your sugar, your eggs tax-free so that you can export them. And you do a bunch of other things in order to qualify for the program. And as Karen was saying, that makes Mexico attractive as a place to build factories, especially if they're export-oriented. So some of those, you may sell the majority of the slices of cake to the US and Canada. Some slices, you sell them in the local market, or you transfer them to another company in Mexico. I think the issue is not that the taxman is going after companies in Mexico. I think the real issue, as Karen was saying, is that rules apply one day and then they can be reinterpreted the other day. The issue with the EMEX program here is that the Mexican tax authorities arguing that by transferring some of these slices of cakes within the country, not necessarily exporting everything, then these companies are liable to pay the original import tax that they didn't have to pay because they were part of the EMEX program, and also a VAT when they sell it domestically. But again, the issue here is retroactive enforcement, not necessarily how companies apply or are part of this program. The other issue that's related to that is that when we made the transition from NAFTA to USMCA, we lost important investment protections. Back in the NAFTA era, all sectors in the Mexican economy were covered by the trade agreement. One of the things that we lost during this transition is that now only a very specific set of sectors is covered. Oil and gas, infrastructure, telecommunications, and power generation. Every other sector outside of those priority sectors covered by USMCA don't have access to USMCA protections. What does that mean? For example, a very important sector for the Mexican economy, which is manufacturing, which are the companies that use this program, are not protected under USMCA. And if they have an issue with the Mexican state or with the local government, they can't use USMCA until they go through the Mexican court system first. This new Mexican court system that may lack the expertise that the previous system had, that it is politically aligned to the party in power. And they must do that at least for 30 months before they start an arbitration process. And just want us to think about the things that we lost during the USMCA NAFTA transition. And also, I don't think there's any appetite, at least from the US perspective, to strengthen those investment protections, particularly from the Mexican side. So if we now have only a specific set of sectors that are protected, we may as well have, in the next version of USMCA, if we get to that, an even weaker version of those protections.
So if I may, I just feel that this brings very much to light why it should be in Mexico's self-interest and not to rely on whether you have a review or a renegotiation or whatever we want to call it with regards to, how do you make your country attractive to investment? And I think, after 30 years, you would have hoped that the child has grown up.
and these issues, by the way, are going to be salient regardless of what happens with USMCA,
Right.
simply by virtue of Mexico's participation in CPTPP. And given the news that came out, I don't think we're facing a scenario like what we saw this morning in Strasbourg and in Brussels, but given that the European Parliament seems to have just pushed the pause button on the FTA between Mercosur and the European Union. Remember, Mexico also has a revamped FTA with the European Union, which we're waiting for ratification from both sides. But regardless of what happens to USMCA, remember, Mexico and Chile are the two countries in the world that have the largest FTA networks anywhere in the world. And so,
Canada.
again, parking USMCA, these issues are relevant for Mexico's ability to compete and to grow beyond what happens in USMCA. I'm not minimizing the relevance of USMCA.
I agree.
but-
I just
but
think,
it's gonna have a
if
domino
we
effect.
look at the last 6 years, I would find it hard to defend that the countries have actually lived up to their USMCA commitments. So they are very
including
big.
the US. But
Right.
Yes.
But there are limits to what is signed on the paper.
Sure. So we have about 10 minutes left. I want to shift the conversation to kind of looking forward. We've got the review. We've also got, I think we should bring in a discussion of potential solutions here. So I throw this open to the panel, and I'll also note that we have gotten a few questions over the course of the event, and so I'll ask a few audience questions in a second. But first, just to the entire panel, whoever wants to chime in the context of the USMCA review, are there enforceable commitments that could be negotiated between the parties on issues like tax and judicial tax and judicial uncertainty? Are there ways that we can safeguard some of this investment, or is it going to be entirely kind of freewheeling?
I think within the context of the USMCA review, if there was the will from the North American partners to reestablish, the independence of certain institutions, and with that, possibly the encouragement of creating independent tribunals to address commercial disputes or to address international taxation issues, that would be one way. And it's not unprecedented. Right. The NAFTA was used to introduce certain independent agencies. We are seeing companies increasingly using within their contracts, arbitration clauses that are addressed in other jurisdictions.
Right.
Now, it's hard when you're facing the government. The government is only going to see the reality, and if the money isn't flowing in, or if we go through, a severe economic shock, that is what tends to kind of shake things up. The peso today is at its strongest it has been in the last 6 years. So it's hard, I believe, that for the government at this point to kind of say, oh yeah, but.
Brett, I might go to you and say, are the kinds of solutions that Karen is talking about, are they things that your member companies have talked about before as being welcome?
Yeah, we're having discussions with USTR and with the U.S. government on kind of what a path forward could be. Certainly, I testified in the USMCA review process, and we're engaged in these discussions. The one element I want to weave in on the judicial reforms, just
Please.
as I bridge into recommendations, is we've talked a lot about the audits and the taxation issues. In the investor state sphere, environment is another issue that's going to have to be resolved, and energy in this agreement.
Yep.
And on the energy side, the nationalization of CFE and PEMEC is continuing to be challenged. And so the lack of ISDS protections in USMCA now is a challenge. However, by and large, we, our members, support USMCA, and we do not want to see the entire agreement rewritten. At this stage, I think the agreement is largely fit for purpose. Changing some of these large aspects, like trying to reintroduce ISDS commitments, may require going back to Congress, depending on how it's written. And ultimately, we think there's an opportunity to see USMCA renewed, but look at upgrades. Look at how to develop things in annexes. And so I think some of what Karen is describing are areas that you can do in side letters. I think there's commitments from Mexico. I think there are things that can be accomplished while maintaining that integrity of the agreement. And so I think that's where we are focused. It will ultimately be up to USTR and up to President Trump in terms of leading the U.S. approach to the negotiations and how much of a rewrite they're looking for. I think they'll focus on these side agreements. I think they'll focus on some targeted upgrades. However, we saw changes to the investor protections with the U.S. and Colombia at the end of the last administration. We've seen changes to chorus that haven't gone back before Congress. And so there are some opportunities there. So we need to, see the lead step of the United States in terms of dancing with its partners of how this is going to shake out. But I think there are opportunities to Mexico to step up and help provide solutions here by showing the confidence in SAT, by showing that they're willing to offer some sort of changes that can restore confidence in the judicial system. So I think that needs to be the focus.
Look, it wouldn't be the first time that a trade agreement is used to motivate domestic
Absolutely not.
changes. And that is where I think the U.S. can help, or the U.S. government. And honestly, I think this is an opportunity for the Sheinbaum administration to kind of seize the moment and, well, she might say, I really didn't want to do this, but,
She has top-level cover.
We've got to do it because this is our largest market, because it is our, she's got top-level cover, as you say.
Ambassador, I'll ask you a question here from the audience. You mentioned in your previous response that Mexico and Chile have the largest free trade architecture of any countries in the world. One of the questions from the audience is specifically about the issue of trade agreements and tax matters. And the question basically says, most trade agreements expressly exclude tax matters. Are there any other trade agreements in Mexico's arsenal or other treaty provisions that you can think of that serve as a model to include these types of concerns that we've been talking about here this morning regarding the abuse of authority and the weaponization
That's a
of
very
SAT?
good question. I have no idea. I'm trying to recall whether CPTPP had
I don't think it has tax
something,
provisions.
but I don't think it did.
So in many ways, we're in
Yeah,
uncharted
yes.
territory.
I think we're a bit in terra incognita. And a lot of that will come down to the imagination and will of particularly the US and Mexico, but it could also include Canada, as long as external geopolitical events don't derail the ability to have these sort of, everything seems to suggest that we will have sort of parallel conversations, at least conversations with Canada and with Mexico, and then with an attempt to devise these annexes or side letters on specific and different issues. But I think there will need to be a lot of new thinking as how we address some of these issues. And there is always a challenge when you negotiate side agreements or annexes. But there's also a huge opportunity because you've got a blank slate. And if you're imaginative and if there's political will, you might be able to solve some of these very pesky issues by doing that.
Talk just a second about the downside. So the main downside is that there's no teeth for enforcement, right, on a side letter.
Well, that's always been the debate since 1993 and NAFTA's entry into force. Do these agreements have teeth? I think there was a big improvement in the transition from NAFTA to USMCA in terms of teeth and enforcement. But again, as we've seen, decisions that were made by panels have not been enforced, starting with the US, the issue that Canada and Mexico won regarding the interpretation of rules of origin for the automotive and auto parts sector, which, as of today, the U.S. is still non-compliant.
Yep.
And side agreements also aren't enforced because there's also 232 side letters. And so, there is a certain level of goodwill that needs to take place in terms of restoring confidence in the agreement.
But that's like any marriage. I mean, if you decide to cheat, that's, you're still married, but
Confidence. I'm not there.
I'm going to go to Diego. I'm going to go to Diego. Rather than go with this analogy, I'm going to go to Diego.
I completely forgot what I was going to say.
Diego, as well, if I can get you to comment
Yes.
on another audience question, which is, in addition to what you were going to say as a response to what you've heard here, give us a sense of what you think, or where you think these issues fall in a list of priorities for the U.S. That's one of the questions from the audience as well.
These issues meaning fiscal governance and
Fiscal governance,
Yes.
tax issues, and the judicial reform in Mexico.
I think fiscal governance is a lot more important than the effects of the judicial reform in Mexico.
Okay.
There are some folks in the U.S. government that see Mexico's investment uncertainty issues as a positive thing because they disincentivize production in Mexico, and thus they might create more incentives to move production to the U.S., although maybe the economic equation is not there. So I think that's going to be one of the top issues alongside non-market economies, meaning the introduction of some language finally in USMCA regarding what do Mexico and Canada need to do about Chinese investment and trade, particularly Mexico on the investment front. And I think there's going to be economic security, fiscal governance, and then just the security agenda and how that impacts trade negotiations.
And the judicial, I must say that at least in Washington, D.C., the more relevant and or dangerous for the Mexican government's perspectives regarding judicial reform have much more to do with drugs and thugs than with a level playing field for businesses in the country. Sort of the possibility that organized crime will cherry pick or intimidate judges in the DA and DOJ and DHS and state is more salient than economy or USTR worrying about legal certainty per the judicial reform.
And I want to say one last thing about just overall compliance. This is not a Mexico issue, as Ambassador Sarakan was saying. The U.S. has failed to comply with some panels. Canada has also had some trade irritants along the way. And in the end, we're in an integrated production ecosystem where uncertainty rises in one jurisdiction, it spreads across the region. And Mexico's story, as well as the United States story, is not a story of failure when it comes to USMCA compliance. It's a story of unrealized advantages. And there's time to fix some of these issues. Others are in the Constitution already. But I think there's still a chance to do some work on secondary legislation to get imaginative, as Karin was saying, on dispute resolution. And one of the things that I would push the Mexican government to work for, and perhaps some of the Canadian stakeholders as well, is to get manufacturing on the covered sectors list during this review process. It's a win-win for everyone.
That's a great positive note to end on. We're a few minutes over, but we also started a few minutes late. Thank you again for coming out on a frigid January Washington morning to be with us. Thanks for joining us online. We have to leave it there, but I will note that this is the second of a series of events we've had on trade irritants, issues that will be a big deal in the USMCA review. We plan on doing a companion event soon looking at US-Canada issues, so there's plenty to talk about there. But for now, we'll leave it here. Ambassador Arturo Sarakan, Brad Wood, Karen Antebi, and Diego Marroquín Bitar, thank you very much.